Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about sort of some of those big ticket sort of questions, and then let's have a little bit of a discussion about what the nature of how we ask those questions has changed over time, and what are the different questions that we ask today than what we used to ask. Again, kind of in this sort of classical, neoclassical, Keynesian, post Keynesian sort of idea. Again, it's very important in this class that we kind of think about everything in terms of the evolution of economics. I think that's a great way to heighten it, raises the stakes a little bit. And I also think it makes it easier to understand because it embeds this sort of development of theory within this sort of historical context. And always the development of theory calls back to some sort of historical thing that occurred, which I think makes it much easier to understand and not just easier to understand the dynamics, but also easier to understand why they occurred. So again, what's the stuff that we care about? We typically in macroeconomics are looking at those aggregates, those economy wide aggregates. So output, employment, inflation, trade, those kind of big ticket stuff. Um, as I mentioned, we're going to vacillate between looking at the short and medium run in the first 3 weeks, and then in that last week, looking at long run sort of economic growth. But throughout, regardless of kind of what it is that we're asking about, what are kind of the main sort of themes of macroeconomics and what would constitute sort of best practices in macroeconomic policy. Stability, right? Stability is one of the most important sort of aspects of economic growth. We don't just want economic growth; we want long run stable economic growth. That's really where we tend to see the prosperity, the sort of living standards really start to increase when you have consistent, stable economic growth over a very long time period. There have been plenty of countries throughout history that have experienced very, very rapid, significant economic growth, but there was no stability to it, and so even to some extent, we might argue that the cause of the economic contraction was in fact the speed of that initial economic expansion, and so there's a lot of conversation in macroeconomics in terms of how quickly is the economy growing, how quickly is it contracting, and to what extent does those dynamics affect how we think about policy. And then in addition to sort of stability, just how is the macroeconomic system performing? How is it sort of doing in terms of growth? How much inflation tends to be kicked up? Do people have access to jobs? Are they underemployed? Is there a skill mismatch in the macro economy? Are there emerging markets in which there will be new jobs coming down the line, and are there skill concerns for folks being able to have those jobs? Is there concern over trade flows, and to what extent do trade flows affect domestic as well as international markets and labor markets? So a lot of stuff for us to sort of contemplate. But the name of the game from a policy perspective is typically going to be about stability and consistency, which is, I guess, a little bit of redundant, but theories provide simplified models so we can explain things. There's a sort of misunderstanding. A lot of people think that in economics we make everything simple because you can't explain the real world. In fact, you can explain the real world, but you have to be able to explain it in a way that people can actually understand it. So that's why we use models. We don't use models because we can't explain realities. We could try, and we could probably explain a lot of realities, but it would make our understanding much more difficult. So we try to keep things relatively simple. And so even in the context of the math we're going to use in this semester, I never want it to sort of take away from the actual economic analysis. That's been an ongoing debate in economics. How mathy is it? It's very mathy, and we have to be careful with that sometimes. We're going to talk about competing models of how the macroeconomy works, both in terms of the short run as well as the long run. The whole point of all this is because economics is this sort of uh, fertile laboratory for running, at the very least, thought experiments about how the economy works and the dynamics that surround it. But also we can not only run those thought experiments, we can actually get data and we can work out the math and we can see what the predictions are. And so economics is all about learning. It's all about learning more about the world around us. How does the economy work? How do people behave within the context of the economy? And what does that mean for long-term economic growth? And is the nature of how people interact with the economy changing? And what does that mean for economic growth? So there is no single correct model. And I really want to reiterate that there is no single correct model. What we're going to do in this class is we're going to look at a bunch of different models, and the end result, the spoiler alert of all that, is that each model has its thing it's bringing to the table, and every model has its weakness. And one of the most important things that we can do in this class is learn different models, learn what makes them strong, what makes them weak, what makes them have predictive power, and what makes them not have predictive power. That really is where the meat and potatoes, I think, of this particular class will come from. So common policy goals, we want people to have jobs. So we want high employment. We don't want inflation to be too distortionary. So we want price stability or inflationary stability. Again, sustainable economic growth. We don't just want to try to grow our economy as quickly as possible. History is replete with incidences and where that eventually catches back up to us. So again, stability, consistency, in a sense, macroeconomics ends up being about how do we limit economic misery to the extent that we promote long-run stable economic growth. I think that's a pretty good way to put it. We'll talk a lot more about classical versus Keynesian views in just a moment. So, macroeconomics. Where does it start as a discipline? It perhaps isn't surprising to you to know that modern macroeconomics starts with the Great Depression. That prior to the Great Depression, there really was no macroeconomics and microeconomics. There was just economics. And so when we talk about classical economics, classical and neoclassical economics, we're talking about really that time period from 17, oops, we're talking about that time period from 1776, up to, let's say, let's call it 1929. So we'll call this the classical era and also neoclassical. Now we'll explain what that means in just a little bit. But classical and neoclassical in 1770. So we had a kind of singular paradigm in economics in terms of how we think, the economy works. And again, remember, this classical time period is all about circular flow. It's about comparative advantage. The economists of this time period were very much free market, laissez-faire in the tradition of Adam Smith. Folks like David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, they had concerns about things like market concentration, and they had concerns about kind of the macroeconomy and what it did to people. But at the end of the day, they tended to be quite free market and quite laissez-faire. The idea was you sort of generally should just kind of let the economy do its own thing, and even if the economy goes down, if it does contract, you really shouldn't do anything about it. That any attempt to try to do something about it would actually make things worse. Then the Great Depression happened, and the thing about the Great Depression that you should understand is it was a period of chronic unemployment that we had never experienced up to that point in U.S. history, which is a little bit hard to believe, because if you think about, the U.S. has been around since the late 1700s, we had never experienced this level of sort of unemployment and not to this extent, which I think is very interesting. So if you look at this graph, you'll see that beginning in 1930, we had extremely low unemployment, right? We were a fully employed economic system. And then we have the speculative bubble in 1929. The stock market crashed. Aggregate demand in the US started to decline, and the government really didn't do anything. Well, I shouldn't say that. The government did a couple different things. We now believe both of those things were really bad. So the first thing the government tried to do is the government tried to replace the lost revenue. So what happened is we have an income tax at this time. Aggregate demand in the economy starts to decline because of the speculative bubble bursting in the U.S. economy. And now all of a sudden the government is starting to run large deficits because it's not generating as much revenue. And so one of the things that the government decided to do was to implement tariffs, and to implement tariffs in particular to shift demand to domestic production, and also the big idea was that you're going to plug that revenue hole that you were losing from that reduction in aggregate demand. That ends up, long term being a huge sort of policy question. The interplay of taxes and government spending, and the interplay of deficits and debt. Obviously, today it's a much bigger issue in many ways than it was back then, and so there's a lot of concern and consternation as to how we're actually going to react to something like, say, a decade of higher than full employment, as we saw here with the Great Depression. And so that's kind of sort of where we're at. The Great Depression happened, and the big thing here is that the classical model could not explain why unemployment stayed so high for so long. So the classical model, which again we had used from Adam Smith up until the Great Depression, said markets are self-correcting. If there is a contraction, the government shouldn't do anything because the market is going to, in a sense, the sort of thought process was it would come back stronger than it was before. That the contraction was actually a sign of some sort of deficiency. And so if the government tried to, in a sense, solve that deficiency, they would just be making things worse. That was the kind of classical view, and that was very influential. That was the way we sort of thought about economic policy. Then that happened. And so the idea of just letting the economy kind of have that much unemployment and then kind of have that much unemployment for that long was seen as a very, very bad mistake. And so we come out of the Great Depression believing very, very strongly that the government should have done something to try to bring down unemployment, whether that was through fiscal stimulus or whether that was through cutting taxes. It certainly wasn't increasing taxes via tariffs. That had the exact opposite effect that you would typically want, and it most likely made the unemployment situation in the U.S. Even worse. So all of this to say, what you have is the rise of Keynesianism. So John Maynard Keynes, who probably is amongst Adam Smith and these folks, the most famous economist of all time. So Keynes was hugely affected by the Great Depression. Keynes was sort of already on the cusp of really starting to question some of these classical and neoclassical ideas, especially as it pertains to the self-correcting nature of the macroeconomy. And then the Great Depression, in many ways, confirmed for Keynes what he had long feared. There was a complete shattering in many ways of this sort of laissez-faire view of economic systems, and understand that this is not just a conversation about how the U.S. economy should operate, but that ultimately the economic consternation that arose during the Great Depression, and again, arguably the subsequent bad policy response to the Great Depression, is in many respects also correlated with the rise of extremism and fascism in Europe and Nazism in Germany. And so, yeah, these are economic questions, and we can think about them in terms of like stock portfolios and so on and so forth. But history tells us that macroeconomics is important because if we get it wrong, things are going to get worse, right? So there's already the bad part of the economy getting smaller and people losing jobs and losing livelihoods, but then it's potentially going to get even worse than that if we don't do something about it. That's what the Great Depression was, a lesson to many economists, that basically the government should take on a much more interventionist role in the economy. Basically, we call this demand management. Prior to the Great Depression, the thinking in economics, the classical idea was Say's law. Okay, Say's law says that supply creates demand. Okay. So if you believe that supply creates demand, then your policy proposal for a country is make as much stuff as possible. Just make and make and make and make, manufacture as much stuff as you can. That's the way you're going to generate demand in your economy. And if supply creates demand, all we have to do is make sure we keep making stuff, and then demand's always going to be there for it. That was the classical, sort of neoclassical view of the macroeconomy. The Great Depression just completely obliterated it. We had plenty of supply in 1929. We had surplus goods in 1929. There was not a lack of products. There were not a lack of homes in 1929. What there was a lack of was money and jobs. And so we come to really reject Say's law during this time period. Say's law is named after Jean-Baptiste Say. And so Keynesianism is, amongst many things, a rejection of the idea that supply creates demand. In fact, Keynes himself argued that basically demand created supply. So the fact that people wanted to spend money on things gave businesses the incentive they needed to produce them. And I can tell you that we sort of vacillate in economics kind of between sort of, kind of the classical and more Keynesian view. Nowadays, contemporarily in 2025, we think Keynes is probably more correct about this than Say was. So we still, kind of reject Say's law, and we tend to accept to some extent Keynes' view of demand. So this is the golden era. One of the reasons why Keynesian economics is so popular is because the global economic system in many parts of the world, just grew and grew and grew, notably here in the U.S. And the reason why that's important is because in the U.S., the government started to essentially take on a Keynesian posture. And so you sort of have post-Great Depression, post-World War II, governments are now taking on a much more interventionist demand management program when it comes to policy. And this is both, by the way, in terms of like fiscal policy, government spending, taxes, but then also as it pertains to central bank policy, right? Because we have the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913. And then that was also kind of one of the big lessons of the Great Depression was that there was really bad monetary policy during that time period. So not only do we have terrible fiscal policy, we now believe we have very bad monetary policy. And so post Great Depression, post World War II, especially, we have much more Keynesian influenced ideas, not just in terms of fiscal policy, but also in terms of monetary policy. And the idea is that from roughly 1950 up until about 1970, things were generally fine. The recessions were relatively small. The sort of unemployment sort of stayed relatively stable. Inflation was relatively stable, and so this was, by most accounts, a sort of vindication of Keynesian ideas. And so, as Nixon famously said, I believe in 1968, we're all Keynesians now. And Nixon continued sort of that Keynesian demand management on into the early 1970s. Unfortunately, though, we learned something else about economic systems, and that was that golden age was going to eventually come to an end. That the sort of Keynesian neoclassical synthesis, which had sort of ruled economics for the better part of 30 years, from around 1945 all the way up until the early 1970s, kind of fell apart. And the reason why it fell apart is an economic event that continues today to have huge implications for policy because it in a sense scared so many people. And that's the stagflation era. So the stagflation era, which is generally sort of considered to be that decade, 1971 to 1981, was essentially not supposed to be able to happen. And so what we mean by not supposed to be able to happen is we mean that we had both high unemployment and high inflation, right? Remember, typically the relationship is that when unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. Or if unemployment were to go up, then inflation would go down. So that if the economy contracted, if we entered a recession, one of the quote unquote good things about that was that we would see deflation, the inflation would actually fall. We did not see that in the 1970s, right? We can see that unemployment rises here and inflation rose here. And we can see that unemployment rises here and inflation's rising even more there. So it's a rejection in some sense of the kind of simple Keynesian neoclassical synthesis that had come to dominate macroeconomics. Well, much like the Great Depression caused us to, in a sense, turn somewhat away from classical and just sort of neoclassical economics into the Keynesian neoclassical synthesis, stagflation caused economists to start to question this Keynesian conventional wisdom, so to speak. So we had oil shocks combined with really bad economic policy, not just from the fiscal policy side, but also on the central bank policy side. And the sort of sense was that the 1970s was a comeuppance, if you will, for Keynesian policies. And remember, the basic idea of Keynesian policy is that the government should intervene in markets when there's going to be some sort of dysfunction. So as the economy is moving into recession, the government should spend money, or the government should cut taxes, or the central bank should lower interest rates or increase the money supply, right? Expansionary fiscal and or monetary policy. And everything was supposed to be kind of okay. But if you look at the 1970s, what you have are instances of increased government spending with no sort of fiscal stimulus showing up much in terms of GDP. So the government's spending more money, but we're not seeing that kind of make its way into the economic system. So it has us start to question that aggregate demand story that the Keynesian synthesis had us believe. The other thing, of course, as well, is that it caused us to now be more concerned than we were previously with the inflationary concerns of interventionist policy. And so a lot of economists sort of argued for a long time that if the government intervenes, if the central bank intervenes, then the most likely result of this is going to be significant inflation. And so that it's sort of looked that way in the 1970s. And what's crazy about the stagflation era is that the only reason that the stagflation era, or I shouldn't say the only reason, but the stagflation era ended basically because the central bank, the Federal Reserve of the United States, engineered a recession in 1981, because basically everything that we had tried to do during the 1970s to try to bring inflation down, to try to bring unemployment down, was not working. And so essentially what the central bank, the Federal Reserve, sought to do in the early 1980s was a financial reset. And we look back at that financial reset and we say, despite the fact that we have a central bank engineering a recession in 1981, it did bring inflation down eventually. Unemployment took quite a while to recover. It really wasn't until kind of close to the late 80s that we see unemployment recover to the extent that it was back in the 1960s. So we sort of dealt with inflation first, and then it took a while for labor markets to, in a sense, heal. So it's the story there is certainly quite mixed. And then kind of 85 on to 2025, with the exception of the dot-com bubble bursting, the Great Recession, and then kind of COVID, we had kind of what I would call the stable years. Consistent economic growth in the U.S., very sort of historically low inflation up until 2022, 2023. Consistently low historically in terms of unemployment as well. So from 85 to 2025, again, with the exception of some of these disruptions, the U.S. economy and many other parts of the world, the global economic system, seems to have done really well. Now, what's interesting is that this stability also coincides with a reemergence of Keynesian ideas, what we might refer to as neo-Keynesian ideas. And so the sort of anti-Keynesian, kind of post-Keynesian sentiments that basically said the government should not intervene in markets, it's only going to cause more problems than it's going to solve, that sort of started to give way a little bit, because the post-Keynesian models, and again, we'll talk about these to some extent, did not do well empirically in the 90s. So basically, the post-Keynesian models did really well in the 1970s. But basically, once you got out of the 1970s, those models really started to not look very good empirically. And so economists started to kind of gravitate back towards what I would refer to as a neo-Keynesian synthesis. It should be pointed out, however, that this neo-Keynesian synthesis did carry with it some of those post-Keynesian ideas. So it's not like neo-Keynesianism is a complete rejection of the post-Keynesian ideas. In fact, I would argue that one of the nice things that happened is that in this sort of neo-Keynesian era that we find ourselves in today, we absolutely brought in some of those post-Keynesian ideas, notably as it relates to things like inflation. So when we saw that inflationary situation that we had in 2022 and 2023, despite the fact that it was clear that the tremendous amount of fiscal stimulus that the U.S. government spit out in 2020 and 2021, that clearly, got the economy back on a solid footing. So you have interventionist government policy that seems to have stabilized the economy, seemed to have moved the economy back to a place where we want it to be. But there's the trade-off of inflationary cost. So we boosted the economy, we got it back to where we wanted it to be, but a side effect of that was enhanced inflationary pressure. And that was the least surprising thing basically of all time. No economist was surprised by the inflation of 2022 and 2023. You can't pump $2 trillion into the economy via fiscal stimulus. You can't pump trillions of dollars into the economy via central bank expansionary policy and not see it show up in terms of inflation. I think actually what a lot of economists now think is that we're surprised there wasn't more inflation, because on top of those stimulatory inflationary pressures, you also had the supply chain disruptions going on back in 2021, and to some extent into 2022. You also had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is in a sense putting upward pressure on prices, and is certainly inflationary. So I think in many ways our sense now is, wow, we were very lucky. We pumped a bunch of fiscal stimulus into the economy. We did huge expansionary monetary policy. That all seems to have worked. That seemed to have got the economy back to full employment, so to speak. But it did come at a cost, and it came at a cost of inflation. And then, in a sense, kind of going back to this idea that macroeconomics matters, one could argue that inflationary pressure is part of the reason why Joe Biden lost the election to Donald Trump in 2024. It's because people felt the bite of inflation, and they blamed Biden for that inflation. Now, to be fair to the Biden administration, U.S. policy basically since 2012 has been inflationary. Government spending, generally kind of cutting taxes here or there. So monetary policy has been pretty expansionary during that time period. So a lot of things were inflationary. It wasn't just fiscal policy from a particular administration. But that's the politics of the nature of the thing. And again, it's part of what we want to talk about throughout this semester. So where does this kind of leave us? Okay, so I'm going to kind of jump here. I just got some nice pictures here of economists. I find very interesting about this, by the way, just really quick. If you go back to the classicals, no beards. Neoclassicals, they all have beards. Keynesians, no beards. So I think I would have been most comfortable around the neoclassicals. What do you think? All right. Anyway. Okay. So let's get to here, because we're going to go through all this stuff. So where does this sort of put us? So where it puts us in terms of short and medium run economic analysis is that basically we now believe that the government does have a role in terms of managing the economy, but that the government has to be very, very careful about how it goes about doing this. It's also the case that government officials have perverse incentives at times in terms of economic policy. There can be self-interested politicians who do things that are in their own political best interest, but are not necessarily in the best interest of the actual economic system. So that's obviously a very big concern. So I would say that kind of the feeling nowadays, and especially after COVID and that experience, is that the government can and should help the economy when it's dysfunctional, when it is, in a sense, below its potential. That's going to be the way that we frame it a little bit later. But that how much the government should intervene and how the government should intervene is really kind of the question. So it isn't really a question of should the government intervene at all. We feel pretty good about saying yes, but how much and what types of intervention should the central bank be going after? That's what modern macroeconomics is all about. And then in terms of the growth, the sort of long run kind of economic sort of analysis, a big question here ends up being about what are the differences between big economies and small economies? What are the differences between rapidly growing economies and much slower growing economies? Can we understand those dynamics and understand what puts countries on particular development paths? I think one of the ideas that I'm really going to sort of introduce to you is to think about economic systems in terms of trajectories. Where we are today and where we're going to be in the future is very much a function of not just what's going to happen economically, but also what we are doing right now from a policy perspective. And so the long run questions of economic growth and kind of how do we keep the circular flow flowing, as it were, is to sort of take these short and medium run questions that are mostly about kind of stability and asking the question, okay, assuming we have stability, what's the best way to actually generate economic growth, and to what level of economic growth is going to maintain that stability? So that's a lot of what the growth section is going to be focused on. Is why do some countries grow differently than others? Why do some countries grow when some don't seem to grow much at all? How can we think about stable economic growth and how it sort of feeds back into increases in standards of living? Because that, at the end of the day, is the macroeconomic thing. We want to know how people are doing, and how should policy attenuate itself to the goals of human prosperity. Right? Now, the difficult thing is that there are opinions all over the place as it relates to this. And we'll talk a lot about all those sorts of opinions. This is not a left wing or a right wing class. This is a class where we're going to sort of look at both sides. We're going to look at sort of ideas that might be considered more left wing and ideas that might be considered more right wing. And what we're going to learn and what we're going to find out is that it is a combination of these ideas that seem to be what we now think is the best policy strategy. It is not just one side or the other. And I think that's useful and has certainly an additional component of importance to our current political situation in the U.S.